Greetings. Today, we will embark on another walking tour of a site that is of huge historical significance to Worcester County. I'm your host, Mr. J, and welcome to Furnace Town. The Museum of Furnace Town is considered a living history museum. What do I mean by living history museum? It's called a living history museum because the historical site, the ground which Furnace Town can be found on, has been recreated to look like it did in the 1820s and the 1830s. And you can get an actual feel for what it was like to be in Furnace Town during that time period. All of the original buildings that were created in the 1800s in Furnace Town are unfortunately gone. The Worcester County Historical Society began rebuilding or recreating the buildings that may have been here in the past during the 1970s to make this an experience for people to enjoy in Worcester County. Oh, but I forgot. There is one original structure that remains here at Furnace Town. It is nearly 200 years old, and that is the original iron furnace, which is right behind me in this video clip. Today, I have two goals. First, I want to teach you the amazing history that is connected to the iron furnace. And second, I want to give you an idea of how this furnace operated. So let's get our learning started about the iron furnace. Furnace Town's history was born in the 1780s. At that time, bog iron was discovered in the swamps of Nassawango. Iron was a resource being used all across the United States. It was used to create many different products made from metal. And since bog iron was discovered in this area, it was a resource that people coveted. Bog iron being in this area around Furnace Town led to the creation of the Maryland Iron Company in 1828. The intentions of the Maryland Iron Company were pretty simple. They wanted to extract bog iron from the swamps in this area so that they could sell it and make a profit. Approximately 2 years later, around 1830, the structure that you see on the screen, the iron furnace, was built by the Maryland Iron Company. This huge iron furnace was strategically placed on the Nassawango Creek. The Nassawango Creek is about 4 miles northwest of Snow Hill. Snow Hill has the Pocomoke River running through it, and that was truly important to iron production in this area. Iron could be transported down the creek to the Pocomoke River, and then from the Pocomoke River could be placed onto large ships that could go to Baltimore and Philadelphia, two cities in need of iron. For about 6 years, the Maryland Iron Company and the furnace did a wonderful job of producing iron. However, in 1836, creditors foreclosed on the iron furnace. Unfortunately, they were not making enough money to continue operating. Then, in 1837, a Worcester County native named Thomas Spence bought the iron furnace and the land surrounding it. His energetic approach to iron production led to 700 tons, let me say that again, 700 tons of iron being produced yearly and shipped right here from the grounds of Furnace Town. However, after a 10-year run, Thomas Spence unfortunately fell into financial ruin. He went bankrupt, and Furnace Town went under. Sadly, Spence's failure was due to a lack of workers that wanted to continue working at Furnace Town, and also a change in iron production that made it easier to get metals from other sources. Because of those two factors, Furnacetown could not survive under the leadership of Mr. Spence. The land around Furnacetown basically sat silent for over 100 years. Trees and vegetation began growing up where there used to be buildings, and the only thing that remained here was this furnace. Luckily, in 1962, a lady named Georgia Foster donated the iron furnace and the land around it to the Worcester County Historical Society. Then changes occurred to create Furnacetown into an experience to teach visitors about the history of this area. The Worcester County Historical Society came in and cleared much of the vegetation that had surrounded the iron furnace over the 100 years. They also made repairs. Since the furnace had been unused for over 100 years, a lot of damage had occurred. It needed to be fixed. Beginning in the late 1970s, the Worcester County Historical Society decided to try to recreate what Furnacetown was like during its prime. They began reconstructing buildings that were similar to the ones that were here in the 1820s, 30s, and 40s. This provided a stupendous opportunity for people to visit and learn the history of the iron furnace. All right, I'm going to bring the history of Furnacetown to a close. I hope you thought it was pretty cool. Now we're going to talk just a little bit about how the iron furnace worked, how it was able to produce a product that was so popular in the 1800s. Step one, or ingredient one, was bog iron, just like what I am holding in my hand. This bog iron was dug up in the swamps of Nassawango. Next, trees, such as pine trees, were burned down into charcoal. Charcoal was the next important ingredient. The final ingredient, which has not been pictured, would be oyster shells. They were needed for the process as well. Those three ingredients, the bog iron, the charcoal, and the oyster shells, were all brought up the ramp that looked like this and then dumped layer by layer into the iron furnace. The charcoal was then set ablaze. They needed to make this furnace hot. That charcoal would burn, and they would use piping in the top to continue to put the heat back into the furnace. Smoke wasn't allowed out. They wanted that furnace to stay hot. The hotter it grew, the easier it would be to melt the bog iron into molten iron. Molten iron means iron that becomes a hot liquid. That iron is heavier than all of the other substances that were inside of the furnace, so it runs to the bottom. Once that blazing, hot, molten iron had sunk all the way to the bottom of the furnace, they would release it out. It would run out into molds. The molds would form molten bricks or blocks of iron. They would allow them to cool and solidify. Then they would retrieve those blocks or bricks of iron, take them to barges, and transport them down the Nassawango Creek to the Pocomoke River so that the iron could be sold. The oyster shells would collect all of the impurities or imperfections that were in that bog iron. They would pull those imperfections out and just dump those in the forest around this area. Once that was done, they would begin this process again, layer upon layer of charcoal, of bog iron, and of oyster shells, and using those layers, they would produce more and more iron. Now, I'm pretty sure I gave you a very simplified or easy version of how the iron was extracted from these swamps and created into iron bars that could be sold. For a better explanation of how iron was produced here at Furnacetown in the 1800s, and for a better understanding of the history, there is one simple answer: come and visit. If you're able to visit, you will not only learn more about the history of this great location, but you will also learn about the different artisans and jobs that had to be done to make Furnacetown a success when it was a booming producer of iron. Mr. J is pointing at Furnacetown's website if you would like more information about this fabulous location. Mr. J would like to say thank you to the marvelous staff here at this Living History Museum. They opened their doors to me and allowed me to create this video to encourage all of you to learn more about the iron furnace in Furnacetown. What an amazing place to see. Hopefully, I can do some more teaching and walking around Worcester County with you in the near future.